The guitar was still humming through the amplifier when the room fell silent. Not because the music had stopped, but because something in the air had changed. A young American nobody had heard of was holding a borrowed Stratocaster, and the man they called God was watching from the side of the stage with an expression no one in that London club had ever seen on his face before. But that moment, the one that would ripple through every corner of rock history, almost never happened. And the reason it almost never happened is a story most people have never been told. London, in 1966, was the center of the musical universe. Not New York, not Los Angeles, not Memphis or Nashville or Detroit. London. The city had become a magnet for every ambitious musician on the planet, a place where blues, rock, jazz, and folk collided in tiny clubs and cramped studios, producing sounds that were rewriting the rules of popular music in real time. The Beatles had already detonated their cultural explosion. The Rolling Stones were channeling raw American blues through British attitude. The Who were turning volume and destruction into a new art form. And at the center of the guitar world, standing taller than anyone else, was a quiet, intensely focused young man from Surrey named Eric Clapton. To understand what happened on that night, you have to understand what Eric Clapton meant to London in 1966. This was not simply a popular guitarist. This was a figure who had achieved something almost unprecedented in the history of popular music. Graffiti across London declared a three-word phrase that had become as familiar as any advertising slogan in the city. The phrase elevated a 21-year-old blues obsessive to the level of divine authority. According to the walls of London, Eric Clapton possessed abilities that transcended the human. He was, in the eyes of an entire generation of British music fans, untouchable. And the evidence supported the worship. Clapton had already burned through the Yardbirds, walking away because they had become too commercial for his purist sensibilities. He had joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers, recording an album that would become a foundational text for every aspiring blues rock guitarist in England. His tone was unmistakable. His phrasing was meticulous. His dedication to the blues tradition was absolute and uncompromising. When he formed Cream with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker in the summer of 1966, the music press treated it like the formation of a supergroup before the word supergroup even existed. Three virtuosos coming together to push the boundaries of what a power trio could accomplish. Clapton's confidence was not arrogance. It was the natural result of being told every single day by fans and journalists and fellow musicians that he was the best. When you hear that enough times, when the walls of your city literally proclaim your divinity, a certain certainty settles into your bones. He had earned his reputation through years of obsessive practice, through a genuine and deep understanding of the blues tradition, through technical abilities that left other guitarists shaking their heads. In 1966, Eric Clapton had no reason to believe that anyone on earth could challenge his position at the summit of electric guitar. But there was one detail that most accounts of this period mention only briefly, and it changes the entire shape of the story. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a 23-year-old guitarist had been paying his dues in a world that Eric Clapton had never experienced. While Clapton studied the blues through records and reverent imitation, this young man had lived the blues. He had grown up in poverty in Seattle, taught himself guitar on a cheap acoustic with the strings restrung for left-handed playing, and spent years on the Chitlin circuit backing artists like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers. He had played in venues where the audience did not politely listen. They danced, they shouted, they demanded that the music move their bodies. If you could not groove, you did not survive. If you could not feel the audience's pulse and respond to it in real time, you were gone by morning. His name was Jimi Hendrix, and by the autumn of 1966, he had been playing guitar professionally for nearly 5 years without anyone outside the rhythm and blues circuit knowing his name. He had been fired by Little Richard for playing too loud and too flamboyantly. He had drifted through bands and backing gigs across the United States, always too wild for the acts that hired him, always too unknown to headline on his own. And he was stuck in a paradox that would have broken most musicians. Too talented to stay in the background, too invisible to step into the spotlight. And then Chandler saw him play in a Greenwich Village club. Chandler was the bass player for The Animals, a successful British band that had scored international hits. But Chandler was thinking about his next chapter. He wanted to manage and produce, and he was looking for an artist who could shake the foundations of the London music scene. When he walked into the Café Wah and heard Jimi Hendrix play, Chandler experienced something that would alter the trajectory of rock music permanently. He did not just hear a good guitarist. He heard something that made every other guitarist he had ever encountered seem incomplete. The plan was audacious. Chandler would bring this unknown American to London, assemble a band around him, and introduce him to the city that considered itself the capital of rock guitar. The risks were enormous. London was fiercely protective of its guitar hierarchy. An unknown outsider, especially an American, especially a black American playing music that blurred every genre boundary the British press had carefully constructed, could easily be rejected, dismissed, sent back across the ocean with nothing to show for the journey. But Chandler had a strategy, and the key to that strategy was a name that everyone in London already knew. The night that changed everything began with a phone call. Chandler had been working to establish Jimi in London for several weeks, arranging small club dates, introducing him to musicians and journalists, building anticipation through word of mouth rather than advertising. But Chandler understood that word of mouth had a ceiling. What Jimi needed was a moment. A single, undeniable moment that would force the London music establishment to reckon with what this quiet American could do. Then Chandler called ahead to the club where Cream was performing and asked if Jimi could sit in for a song. The accounts of what happened next vary depending on who tells the story, but certain details remain consistent across multiple sources and biographies. What is clear is that permission was granted, and Chandler brought Jimi to the venue knowing that the most important audience in London would already be assembled in one room. Not just fans, musicians, journalists, producers, and the people who decided what British rock sounded like. Jimi arrived at the club dressed in clothes that would have turned heads anywhere in 1966 London. The military jacket, the wild hair, the rings and scarves that would soon become iconic. But according to those who were there, what stood out most was not his appearance. It was his silence. While the club buzzed with conversation and anticipation, even while other musicians traded jokes and compliments and the usual backstage bravado, Jimi said almost nothing. He watched. He listened. He absorbed the energy of the room with an intensity that made some people uncomfortable, because they could not read what was happening behind those dark, watchful eyes. Cream took the stage and delivered the kind of performance that had made them the most talked-about band in London. Clapton's guitar work was fluid, precise, emotionally resonant. Baker's drumming was a force of nature. Bruce's bass lines were melodic and powerful. They were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. The audience responded with the enthusiasm that Cream had come to expect. This was their territory, their city, their moment. But backstage, something was already shifting. Chandler had told Jimi what he was walking into. He had explained who Clapton was, what he meant to London, what the graffiti on the walls said. And Jimi had listened to that information with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. He did not boast. He did not make predictions. He simply nodded, as if the information was useful but not particularly relevant to what he was about to do. The moment arrived between sets. Chandler made the introduction. The details of the brief exchange between Clapton and Hendrix before the performance have been recounted in various biographies with slight differences. But the essence remains the same. There was politeness, there was curiosity, and there was, on Clapton's part, the comfortable confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged on his own stage. Then Jimi picked up a guitar. What happened in the next few minutes has been described by those who witnessed it as one of the most significant musical moments of the 1960s. And to understand why, you have to understand what Jimi chose to play and how he chose to play it. And he did not try to outplay Clapton at Clapton's own game. He did not attempt a technically dazzling display designed to prove speed or precision. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He played a Howlin' Wolf song, a deep blues number that lived in the same tradition Clapton had dedicated his life to mastering. But Jimi played it in a way that revealed dimensions of the blues that Clapton had never accessed. Not because Clapton lacked talent or dedication, but because Jimi's relationship with the music came from a different place entirely. The sound that emerged from the amplifier was unlike anything the room had heard before. It had the raw, emotional weight of the Delta blues, the rhythmic sophistication of rhythm and blues, the harmonic freedom of jazz, and something else. Something that did not have a name yet. Something that existed in the spaces between genres, and in the territory that Jimi had been mapping alone for years while playing backup for artists who had no idea what they had standing behind them. His fingers moved across the fretboard with a fluidity that seemed to defy the physical limitations of the instrument. He bent strings to places they were not supposed to go, and somehow the notes that emerged were not just in tune, but more expressive than notes played in conventional positions. He used feedback not as noise, but as a voice. And he made the guitar sing, cry, scream, and whisper, sometimes within the same phrase. But the most remarkable thing was not the technical virtuosity. It was the feeling. Every note carried emotional information that went beyond what most guitarists could communicate in an entire concert. The blues was not a style Jimi was performing. It was a language he was speaking natively, adding vocabulary that no one had known the language possessed. The reaction in the room was immediate and visceral. According to accounts that have been repeated across decades of music journalism and biographical research, the club fell into a stunned silence during the performance. Musicians who had been chatting stopped mid-sentence. Drinks were set down untouched. The casual atmosphere of a London club night evaporated, replaced by the charged intensity of people witnessing something they knew was historic even as it was happening. And then there was Clapton. Biographies and accounts from that era describe Eric Clapton's reaction in terms that suggest genuine emotional shock. The man, whose name was spray-painted across London as a declaration of divine musical ability, found himself confronting a reality he had never imagined. There was someone who could do things on the guitar that he could not do, not marginally better, not slightly more advanced, fundamentally different. He'd operating on a plane of musical expression that made his own considerable abilities feel, for the first time, limited. According to various accounts of that evening, Clapton went backstage during Jimi's performance. Some sources describe him as visibly shaken. Some describe him as near tears. The exact emotional state is impossible to verify decades later, but what remains consistent across all accounts is that the experience was profound and destabilizing. The foundation of his musical identity, the absolute certainty that he was the best guitarist in the world, had cracked in the space of a few minutes. But here is where the story becomes something more than a tale of one musician humbling another. Because what happened next reveals something about both men that is more important than any display of technical ability. Clapton did not react with anger. He did not dismiss what he had heard. He did not retreat into defensive criticism or claim that Jimi's playing was all flash and no substance. Instead, according to the biographical record, Clapton recognized what he was hearing for exactly what it was. Greatness. Not the kind of greatness that comes from practice and dedication alone, though Jimi had both in abundance. The kind of greatness that emerges when natural ability, lived experience, and an uncompromising artistic vision converge in a single human being. And Jimi, for his part, showed no interest in conquest. He had not come to the club to destroy Eric Clapton's reputation or claim his throne. There was no victory speech, no gloating, no public celebration of having outplayed the man they called God. In the accounts that survive from that night, Jimi was characteristically quiet afterward. The same watchful silence that had preceded his performance returned once the guitar was set down. This is the part of the story that most retellings rush past, but it may be the most significant detail of all. In the days and weeks that followed, Jimi's reputation in London transformed from curiosity to phenomenon with a speed that had no precedent. Musicians who had been at the club told other musicians. Journalists who had witnessed the performance began writing about this unknown American with an urgency that suggested they understood they were documenting history. The word spread through London's music community like electricity through a circuit. And suddenly everyone wanted to see the guitarist who had done something impossible. But the impact on Clapton was more complex and more interesting than simply being outplayed. According to interviews Clapton gave in subsequent years, that night initiated a period of genuine artistic crisis. Not just wounded pride or competitive frustration, but a fundamental re-examination of his relationship with music. He had built his identity around being the master of a specific tradition. Jimi had shown him that the tradition was larger and deeper and more alive than he had ever imagined. The crisis could have gone in many directions. Clapton could have doubled down on his existing approach, dismissing Jimi's playing as a different genre or a flashy trick. He could have retreated from public performance, unable to face stages knowing that someone better existed. He could have tried to imitate what Jimi did, copying the surface elements without understanding the deeper architecture. Instead, Clapton did something that reveals the genuine quality of his own character. He grew, not immediately, not without difficulty. But over the months and years that followed, Eric Clapton's playing evolved in ways that biographers and music historians have traced directly to the impact of encountering Jimi Hendrix. His tone became warmer. His approach became more emotionally open. He began incorporating influences beyond the strict blues purism that had defined his earlier work. The experience of being humbled did not diminish him. It expanded him. And this is what makes the story remarkable. Two musicians, both extraordinary, both dedicated to their art with an intensity that most people never bring to anything in their lives, encountered each other at a moment when one was at the peak of his confidence, and the other was about to announce himself to the world. The encounter could have produced rivalry, bitterness, resentment. Instead, it produced mutual respect and, eventually, a friendship built on shared devotion to the same instrument and the same fundamental belief that music was worth dedicating a life to. In the months that followed, Jimi's rise was meteoric. The Jimi Hendrix Experience released music that changed the boundaries of what rock could sound like and what the electric guitar could express. His debut album became a landmark. His performances became legendary. Everything that Chandler had gambled on when he brought an unknown American to London was paying off beyond any reasonable expectation. But even as Jimi's fame exploded, those who knew him described the same quality that had been present in that club on the night he first played for Clapton. The quietness, the watchfulness, the sense that even at the center of a hurricane of fame and adulation, Jimi was listening to something that no one else could hear. He did not carry himself like a conqueror. He carried himself like a student, always learning, always absorbing, always reaching for sounds that existed just beyond the edge of what the instrument had done before. Clapton and Hendrix would encounter each other multiple times over the next few years. The accounts of these meetings consistently describe a relationship built on genuine admiration. There was no rivalry in the conventional sense. Clapton had accepted, with a grace that speaks to his own depth of character, that Jimi operated on a different level. And Jimi, with the humility that everyone who knew him described as one of his most striking qualities, never treated his abilities as a weapon or a source of superiority. Years later, reflecting on that period, Clapton described the experience of hearing Jimi play for the first time as one of the most important moments of his musical life. Not because it was painful, though it clearly was, but because it showed him that the instrument he had dedicated his life to was capable of things he had never dreamed of. The encounter did not diminish his love of guitar, it deepened it. It showed him that the landscape was larger than he had known, and that there were territories still to explore. The story of that night in London has been told many times in biographies and documentaries and magazine articles spanning more than 5 decades. It has become one of the foundational myths of rock history, a moment when the torch was passed from one era to another, when the old guard met the future and recognized it immediately. But beneath the mythology, beneath the dramatic narrative of the unknown challenger and the reigning champion, there is a simpler and more human truth. 2 young men who loved music encountered each other in a small club in London. One played something extraordinary. The other had the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to let it change him. That is not a story about competition or hierarchy, or who was the greatest guitarist in the world. It is a story about what happens when talent meets talent, and the response is not fear, but wonder. The graffiti on the walls of London did not disappear overnight. The phrase that had proclaimed Clapton's supremacy continued to appear for months and years afterward. But its meaning had shifted, and it no longer represented an unchallenged claim. It represented a moment in time, a snapshot of a world that had existed before a quiet American picked up a guitar and showed everyone in the room that the ceiling they thought existed was actually a floor. Jimi Hendrix did not come to London to dethrone anyone. He came to play. He came because a bass player from Newcastle heard something in a Greenwich Village club that he knew the world needed to hear. He came because the music inside him had been waiting for a stage big enough to hold it, and London, with its tiny clubs and enormous ambitions, turned out to be exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The night Jimi played at that London club was not the end of Eric Clapton's story. It was, in many ways, the beginning of his most important chapter. The chapter where he stopped being a god and started becoming an artist. Where he traded certainty for curiosity and discovered that the second was far more valuable than the first. And Jimi, who had arrived in London with nothing but a guitar and a vision that no one else could see yet, walked out of that club into a future that would be as brief as it was brilliant. Within 4 years, everything would change again. But on that night, in that room, with the amplifier still humming and the silence still hanging in the air, 2 musicians stood at the intersection of what music had been and what it was about to become. One of them had just learned that greatness has no ceiling. The other had just proven it. Sometimes the most important moments in music history do not happen at festivals or in stadiums or during carefully staged performances. Sometimes they happen in small rooms, between sets, when nobody is recording and the only audience is a handful of people who happen to be paying attention. The night Eric Clapton met Jimi Hendrix was one of those moments. Not because of who won or who lost, because that framing misses the point entirely, but because it proved that music, at its deepest level, is not a competition. It is a conversation, and sometimes the most powerful thing one musician can say to another is nothing at all. Just pick up a guitar and let the sound speak for itself.